I am Grady Colaine, the CapeCod.com News Center, and welcome to Sunday Journal. I'm joined today by Andrew Gottlieb, Executive Director of the Association of Preserve Cape Cod. Talk a little bit more about water quality issues and success stories. We have some ongoing projects in Dennis I wanted to chat about related to stormwater runoff. But you guys also just released the sixth annual State of the Waters report, which indicates some rather unacceptable quality levels for some of our water. Public drinking water seems to be doing all right, but can you give us a general overview of what that is, dive a little bit more into the details for us?
Sure. So it's as you mentioned, this is the sixth year we've been doing this, and basically the high level conclusion from the report is that our drinking water supply remains of high quality. Most of the water suppliers on the Cape are providing excellent water to their communities. The presence of PFAS compounds, perfluorinated compounds, the so-called forever chemicals, below state drinking water standards continues to be an issue in more than half of the water supplies that we measure and that we evaluated. And that's just something we're going to have to deal with over the long haul. But the water in the pipes that goes to consumers is of very good quality. Our estuaries continue to be, in highly degraded condition across the region. And in fact, because 90% of the estuaries have shown signs of poor water quality, all of the south-facing estuaries, all but one of the west-facing estuaries on the Buzzards Bay side, and some of the more significant systems on the north side, all showed degraded water quality. We actually did not score the estuaries again this year for the simple reason that the initiatives a number of towns have begun to take to finance and begin construction on necessary wastewater management projects are not far enough along yet to reduce enough nitrogen load for us to anticipate any real improvement. So the scope and range of poor water quality in the marine environment was so sweeping that and so deeply entrenched and created over a multi-decadal period that nothing would have changed yet. And that is to say that, while 90% of our estuaries being impaired is clearly an unacceptable outcome, we actually have a fair bit of optimism that the Cape has started down the road that we all know is necessary to restore water quality. And really, at this point, it's a matter of staying the course, of continuing to develop additional phases of each of the town's wastewater management projects. But as long as we stay the course and continue to invest in improved treatment, we know that these estuaries are going to come back.
All
So,
right.
for the first time, I think we can report that even while the current conditions are terrible in the marine environment, there is actually a reason for optimism given the votes that have taken place in the majority of the towns across the region to do what is necessary to stop ongoing pollution and begin to remediate. That leaves us with the ponds. And we're really quite frankly unhappy about where we are with our freshwater resources. There's a little bit of variability year over year, but roughly, a third of, or a little less than a third of our freshwater ponds that we measure and evaluate are showing signs of bad water quality in a given year. But more than half of the ponds are what we would consider to be marginal. And whether they are marginal on the good side of the line or marginal on the bad side of the line is really a function of the weather conditions that we experience in any given summer. We've had really dry years, we've had really hot years, we've had really wet years, and certain ponds do better or worse under those circumstances. But the reality remains that our ponds are impacted by the same things that have degraded our estuaries: excess nutrients, the primary sources being poorly treated sewage, primarily discharged through septic systems, stormwater runoff into our ponds, and excess fertilizer runoff from lawn and garden applications, especially around pond front properties. And for the most part, we are nowhere near where we need to be as a region in getting our head around what's going to happen with our ponds, what we need to do to reduce the nutrient load in our ponds. No town has a comprehensive program established yet, like they do for their estuaries, to restore ponds. And so, what we really are calling for in this report is a greater emphasis on and commitment to improving our freshwater resources in a way that mirrors what has become the public policy consensus around the need to improve our estuaries.
Mhm. Even if the pollution were to be stopped, would there need to be rehabilitation efforts as well, or would stopping at the source be enough?
Well, let's start with the fact that we need to stop the excess inputs of nutrients from the landscape if we have any hope of restoring these ponds. In some ponds, that means once those external loadings are eliminated, in other words, once towns develop infrastructure that goes around the ponds that replaces traditional septic systems, once people stop fertilizing their lawns and rebuild some of the riparian habitat with native plants, and once we do a better job pulling stormwater from directly being discharged from roadways where it carries all manner of pollutants off the roads directly into the ponds and begin to do a better job managing that. Some of those ponds will require in-pond remediation beyond that because phosphorus does tend to accumulate at the bottom of these ponds, and because for other reasons these ponds are becoming oxygen deprived at the bottom because of warmer temperatures, and those phosphorus loads can release back into the pond. So some ponds will require more than just the elimination of additional new sources of phosphorus, but we have to start there with all of them. And so, in many respects, there's no need to wait to get the precision that one would want for a comprehensive monitoring program. There's no reason to wait to begin to reduce nutrient loading to our ponds for the final answer. You don't need to know everything to do anything. And so part of what we're calling for as part of this report is, a renewed effort or an increased effort on the part of the individuals to just get off the fertilizers. Stop fertilizing lawns adjacent to your ponds. That green lawn brings you a green pond. It does your pond a lot of harm. And there's things that people can do immediately in how they choose to live their life around these ponds that will benefit the environment and keep the pond looking like what brought them there to be there in the first place, as opposed to a green mess.
Mhm. Do you think that there needs to be kind of more action from towns and like bylaws of like fertilizer outlawing essentially, or?
Well, I think, really, the town's ability to regulate fertilizer and pesticide is unfortunately largely preempted by state authority. And so the towns have a very limited ability to implement rules and regulations that would make a meaningful improvement without express additional authority from the legislature, which some towns, Orleans and some others have sought and not yet received from the legislature. So while those are worthy and important efforts that we support, the truth of the matter is that you or I or anybody else who lives around a pond have all the power we need right now to make a decision not to fertilize our lawns.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, this is really a personal behavior and personal values choice that we're asking people to make that doesn't require government intervention. Sure, the towns can and should be and have the capability right now to they know where their stormwater pipes go. They know that they could pull those stormwater pipes back out of their ponds to work with us and other organizations to implement more environmentally sound stormwater controls that would keep the water off the road, but without using the pond as the ultimate receptacle. That can all happen now. And towns can begin to do the planning necessary to reevaluate and incorporate into their wastewater management plans the needs of remediation for fresh waters. And so there's a lot that can happen now to start the ball rolling. And that's really a lot of what our emphasis is going to be in 2025, 26, and beyond to begin to really take seriously making better what's happening in and to our fresh waters.
Mhm. All right, now while we're on the topic, I actually would love to hear more about some of the stormwater efforts you guys are undertaking. I know there's a project going on in Dennis. Do you want to elaborate more for us?
Sure. So APCC was fortunate to get some grant money to do a project around boat ramps. So if anybody who launches a boat, uses a boat ramp, knows that you got a large parking lot and a nicely paved roadway that slopes down into the pond. And so it's the perfect conduit for all manner of stormwater directly into these ponds. And so we identified 20 or so priority boat ramps, and we're able to use some of the grant money to work on design and engineering of stormwater controls for a subset of those boat ramps. And some have started to go to construction. The one that's gotten a little bit of attention recently has been a project that we've been able to work with the town of Dennis and help them with the design, engineering, and financing of in Scargo Lake, where we're able to put in a combination of methods that keep stormwater out of the pond while preserving the high quality boat ramp. And among them are things like porous pavement. So, most a standard pavement will, it's hard and it allows water to, traverse the surface but not penetrate. Porous pavements and porous pavers are designed to allow water rather than to run off the site to be absorbed on the site. And so there's pores in the paving material that sit on a deep layer of crushed stone and porous materials that allow the water the opportunity to infiltrate back into the ground rather than accumulate and run off into the pond. The portion that does run off, we design catchment areas that allow the water to be caught before it goes into the pond. And in being caught, it allows the sediment, the sand, the grit that would otherwise impair the water body to settle out onto the bottom. And then we rely on plantings, use nature um, to take the nutrients out of the wastewater, the road runoff before it hits the pond. So we put it in these retention areas where the silts and fines drop out and where the plants that we put in that like getting wet, certain species that do well in wet environments, um, will use the nutrients that are on the roadway to promote growth and keep it out of the lake. So we've got this project going in Scargo right now in Dennis. It's one of two. And then we have a number of these other projects queued up and ready to go. Either we have financing for them in other towns, or we're working with the towns to find money to do that. And frankly, once we get through the priority projects, almost every boat ramp on Cape Cod could stand for some improvement to its stormwater management. And that's just the start, but it's an obvious place. It's where people recreate, where they launch their boat to enjoy the opportunity. We don't want that enjoyment launch point to be a major source of contamination to these ponds.
hmm It's really interesting. I've been unfortunately privy to a lot more of what's been like on the roads as of late. I recently got a motorcycle, and I've never been more aware of all the gunk that is on pavement in general across America. But I assume it's also like the oils and stuff. But I mean, you
Like
also
you get a lot of things, you get sediment, you get sand, not just sand because we live on a sandy peninsula, but especially during the winter, we're putting sand down for traction and traffic maintenance. With road salts, there's all the drippings that come from leaky oil cases, broken seals on the vehicles. So there's a lot of hydrocarbon contamination, there's spilled gasoline. And there's also a fair amount of nutrient, to the extent that people, are fertilizing and they use a spreader and the spray goes off the lawn and onto the sidewalk or onto the street. All that accumulates when the rain's hard, washes into, collects from area far away from uh, from a pond, but can end up in a stormwater conveyance or run of the road, run off into the pond, and then all manner of bacteria and waste from animal, pet people not picking up after their pets, wild animals defecating on the property. Anyway, so the stormwater and that first flush, that first rainstorm, first half inch of a rainstorm can have a fairly heavily concentrated myriad of pollutants that run directly into these ponds.
Mm. Yeah, I one of the lessons that they were telling me is like when if you're worried about like car traction or tire traction in general, is like, oh, wait about 10 minutes after the storm has started, so that way all the gunk and oil and
Right.
slips is washed away. And I'm just sitting there going, but where? And the answer is but here is yeah,
Answer is the nearest water body.
yeah. All right. Well, in the meantime, though, what are some other like problem locations? Is Escargot Lake with this particular project, but just like in freshwater in general, are there some problem children ponds that you guys are keeping an eye on, or?
Well, we've got, we look at about 150 of the 890 ponds on Cape Cod. And depending on the issue, whether it's just standard water quality parameters, we're doing sampling in 50 of those for the Cape Cod Commission to understand water quality. All that information is getting posted. We also do, as you know, our cyanobacteria monitoring. And sure, we have a handful of ponds, whether it's Santuit and Mashpee, a Shumat Pond and Mashpee, Cliff Pond sometimes, and Upper Mill and Brewster pop up fairly frequently. There's a handful in Barnstable that pop up. You know, there's, some really bad ones, but there's, like I said earlier, a bunch that are fairly well spread out across the Cape that are all under some manner of stress. And sort of the best way for people to follow that is, at our apcc.org website during the sampling season, which is now over and will begin again come March. We do real-time posting of the monitoring that we're doing so people can look at that site on a regular basis and get the best up-to-date information on how a pond is behaving in the last week to 2 weeks when we're doing our sampling. And I
Mhm.
would encourage folks to, take advantage of that opportunity to look at that information and then make an informed decision based on their own level of risk tolerance, where they want to recreate. The good news is there's always a pond on Cape Cod somewhere that's got good water quality and which gives you an opportunity to go out and enjoy. The bad news is during the summer season, there's generally some place on Cape Cod that has an issue of concern that people ought to be aware of to protect themselves and their pets from undue exposure to, cyanotoxins or poor water quality.
Mm. Yeah, I remember there was that store. The story I believe was like a couple of years ago now, but someone's pet unfortunately it died after ingesting some of these cyanotoxins, which is very unfortunate. Children and pets especially susceptible to it. When it comes to the just real quick, like the data collection for like these
Yep.
things like the state of the Cape and also the cyanobacteria, how do you do it? Do you have volunteers? Is it scientists? Are you out there
So
taste testing with a mug? Like how does it go?
So it runs in a lot of different ways. Our cyanobacteria monitoring and our overall water quality monitoring of freshwater ponds is done in a combination between APCC staff and volunteers. There are other partnering organizations with whom we work, Orleans Pond Coalition, Falmouth Water Stewards. There's organizations and groups across the region that work with us, and sometimes they do collections for the cyano and bring them to APCC where we read and interpret. In other cases, we're out there with them and getting the information. As it relates to the marine water quality that is in the report and the drinking water quality, we APCC are not doing the sampling ourselves. We are utilizing data that is otherwise available in the public sphere, not easy to get to and not easy to interpret and not easy to convey to the public in a easily digested and understood method, which is why we do this report. Because I hope you'll agree after having looked at it that the visual way that we use red and blue is good and bad gives you a very clear sense of where there are problems and where there are not problems. So part of the value of this report is it gives people a one-stop location to access a lot of data that they would have to work really hard to find on their own. And it allows you as a user, depending on how much you want to know, to just look at the map and say, my pond's a good, my pond's bad, and that's where you stop, and that's where a lot of people stop, and that's fine. or it gives you access all the way down to the raw spreadsheets of the data and tells you how we scored them and lets you cross-check us and do your own math if you want to. And there are a number of users who like that opportunity. So that's one of the values of this report.
Mhm. Why is a lot of the South Side embayments are routinely impaired? Why is that? Is there a theory on why the South Side is just seems to be having a bit more issues,
Yeah,
or?
it's actually pretty easy. It's a combination of things. One, south side embayments tend to be pretty heavily developed. They're almost uniformly reliant on septic systems for their waste disposal. And we know that septic systems don't remove nitrogen hardly at all, and certainly not in a manner that was sufficient to not impair water quality. When you combine that density of development, just the mass loading of nutrients into the groundwater that finds its way into these estuaries, with the fact that on the south side in particular, the tidal exchange is relatively small. It's a 2 to 3 foot difference between high and low tides. Um, the openings where the water exchange takes place in the south side tend to be relatively narrow and small compared to the size of the estuary. So you're getting a lot of loading, not a lot of freshwater flushing from the relatively clean waters of Nantucket Sound or Buzzards Bay. And it allows that nitrogen load to sit in those estuaries and feed algal growth over a long period of time. That contrasts with the north side, where development pressure generally tends to be somewhat less. Um, the embayments have much larger openings. Think Wellfleet Harbor, think Barnstable Harbor. Very wide openings relative to the size of the embayments. And you've got an 11, 10, 11, 12-foot tidal exchange twice a day. So you have a lot more flushing, a lot more opportunity to exchange water, and a lesser load. And that really explains why the south side and the west side are show worse water quality in general than what you see on the north side.
Mhm. All right. Well, that does kind of bring to mind, though, a lot of this stuff sounds like it's not going to really be fixed until the introduction of like sewer systems and stuff. But a lot of these are towns with like 30-year plans. So are we going to be
Right.
on the annual 36th State of the Waters before we finally start seeing some better news, you think? Or
I think y- we'll be far in the future before there's a state of the waters report that shows 90% of our estuaries in high quality versus where we are with 90% in poor quality. Um, we will start to see over the next several years, however, improvement in water quality within these embayment systems. It may take a while for it to show that the whole system has gotten better. But what we'll start to see as we reduce the loading and as the loadings that have been in the groundwater work themselves through the environment and flush themselves out, that high quality waters will begin to return to these estuaries from the ocean side landward. We'll begin to see better water quality closer to the exchange point, and that will begin to work its way up toward the headwaters. The longer towns take to implement different phases, the longer the restoration is going to take. Um, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody more impatient to see improvement than me. And I will acknowledge the fact that it took us decades to screw these things up, and it's going to take a while to fix them. And people should recognize that there is a time lag, um, but that you don't start to see improvement until you start to reduce the loadings. So the longer you wait, the less likely you're going to live long enough to see the improvement. The sooner you start, the better off we're all going to be.
Mhm. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for this conversation. It has been enlightening, but also while we're here, do you mind if I ask you about how this year has been for the association in general? We're about coming up to the end of 2024. So how's the year in review been for you? And anything exciting for next 2025 for you
Sure.
guys?
So I think we're going to look back on 2024 as a transformational year for APCC. And for that reason, the reason I say that is, we saw um, 20 in this past year, the fruits of many years of labor on a number of fronts. We had been working for a number of years on the protection of the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve. Those efforts were rewarded when the governor um, stop the proposed gun range that threatened the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve. That was a multi-year effort that is going to provide, a long-term and preserve a long-term, long needed future water supply for the residents of the Upper Cape. So I think we're going to look back at 2024 as a year where water supply interests on Cape Cod were protected for future generations. Similarly, we were fighting for years Holtec's plan to dump wastewater into Cape Cod Bay as part of their decommissioning process. The Commonwealth denied Holtec the permission to do that, utilizing the legal framework and rationale that APCC had provided to the incoming Healy administration when they arrived in office over 2 years ago. So again, long-term benefit to anybody who relies on Cape Cod Bay for recreation, for economic well-being, for our tourist industry, for our shellfish and finfish industries, for our real estate industry. So a major win for the broader community of Cape Cod. And then we were also fortunate as an organization to be awarded over almost $18 million in federal funding from federal agency, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that we are going to be using to restore 6 natural systems in towns across Cape Cod in partnership with the communities as well as other partnering organizations. APCC was fortunate to get the fifth largest award nationally for restoration efforts under this funding pot. So it was an opportunity for us to make a major reach to play at a national scale and to demonstrate to the agencies across the country that the work that's being done locally on Cape Cod to restore coastal wetlands, cranberry bogs, and naturally flowing freshwater systems that's happening here on Cape Cod serves as nobody's doing it better than we are. And so we've been able to use that funding to, invest in the staff that's going to work with the towns. Of the 18 million, 16 and a half, $17 million is actually going into the ground in restoration work. So we look at this year as a place where a year when we were able to, after years of work and building credibility in that area and partnerships, bring real money onto Cape Cod to solve water quality habitat problems and put ourselves in a position to be more sustainable and resilient in light of some of the changes we're seeing. So it was a great year for us. We're not resting on our laurels. It's often said about conservation victories, they require constant vigilance. And so it's not like we so to say, oh, we protected the Upper Cape water supply, we can turn our back on it and go pay attention to something else. We're going to continue to pay attention to that. We're going to continue to hold Holtec accountable for the work that they're not allowed to do and make sure that they don't do it. And at the same time, we're going to be launching a major initiative with our land community partners to create the political impetus and the financing tools and the energy around a major investment in protecting the remaining open space on Cape Cod that serves as critical habitat for water quality purposes, as well as species and human use and recreation. So you're going to hear a lot from us in the coming years about the need to protect our remaining green spaces if we want to stay the kind of place that we are.
All right, awesome, Andrew. Thank you very much, and we will stay tuned. Appreciate you having this conversation with me.
Always a pleasure.
I'm Grudy Gillane in the CapeCod.com News Center, and thank you for listening to Sunday Journal.